Ladies and gentlemen, my name is TotalBiscuit. I apologize for the croaky voice. It is early in the morning, 8:57 a.m. And I'd like to talk a little bit about Doom. More specifically, a lack of Doom. Now, it was last week that we put out a tweet warning people that there would be no review copies available for Doom. The quote that we got from Bethesda, which has been given to every other outlet, as we saw a little bit later on, went as follows. Doom is comprised of a single-player campaign, online multiplayer, and snap map. We believe all three elements are important parts of the complete Doom experience and are meant to be experienced as part of a complete package. As Doom's snap map and multiplayer modes both require access to a server that won't be live prior to launch, review copies will arrive on launch day. Great. So that basically means that the only stuff you're ever going to see of Doom prior to release, outside of the stuff that you saw of the multiplayer beta, which was not particularly promising, is going to be paid promotional material, stuff that was recorded in a controlled environment, or actual trailers and official footage from the developer. None of that stuff, of course, is an honest representation of what the game is actually going to be. The most egregious of those three types is obviously paid promotional material, because you can never truly know just how honest the person is being as they're speaking about it. Hopefully they disclosed that they were sponsored. There's nothing necessarily wrong with doing those deals, but ultimately the person's going to be biased because there is a sack of cash involved, so you're not exactly going to be slamming the game, are you? You know, that's not something that happens, and there's sometimes a combination of doing a sponsored event or stream in an environment which is controlled, which is at the studio or whatever, because the studio will not let the build out of their site. That is actually surprisingly common. So those videos are guaranteed to be nothing but shilly little hype pieces, whatever way you choose to present them. It's just the nature of the beast. Outside of that, of course, you have your carefully controlled footage, which is given in drips and drabs to outlets such as IGN and GameSpot. You know, they might get a little bit of exclusivity here and then. It might be thrown a bone, essentially. And in doing so, they become part of the marketing machine. And last but by no means least, official trailers, which we know for a fact we can't trust. So, can you explain to me exactly why it is that Doom is number 2 on the top sellers list? Well, it's probably got something to do with the fact that they're giving away a free game with it, the expand alone for Wolfenstein the New Order, Wolfenstein the Old Blood, a reasonable incentive. People might tell themselves, well, I was going to buy it anyway and now I can get a free game, so why would I not? They also have a preload option, and no doubt this game is going to be huge in terms of its storage size. That is very common for id games, so I would thoroughly expect it to be very large, so the preload is going to be beneficial to some people. So you can make that argument as well, and of course you get random little awful things like 6 hack modules, 3 id logo patterns, 6 metallic paint colors, and so on and so forth. Useless tat, basically, but hey, there you go. As of the time of recording, the game is coming out in approximately 15 hours, although it'll be a little bit closer by the time this video comes out. So, what exactly do you do when a game doesn't have a review copy? Well, unfortunately, I think we know what a lot of consumers do, and that's buy the damn thing by pre-order anyway. Now, of course, if you played the multiplayer beta and really enjoyed it, you have at least a reasonable reason to be purchasing the game early. If you haven't, well, you might want to go to Vegas, because at least you have a chance of winning extra money when you gamble. I'm not going to rag on pre-orders any more than I already have. I feel like I've said my piece on the subject, and I don't think I can really add anything to it, but I would like to talk a little bit about what exactly happens when you deny review copies to reviewers, and what you as a viewer should expect when that sort of thing happens. There's a common assumption that the denial of review copies prior to launch is an issue of trying to hide something. Often it will indicate a lack of confidence in the product because you are not giving it to critics prior to release. You believe that critics will not respond well to it, and as a result they will impact your day one sale. So what do? Well, if you're a cowardly sort, you deny those critics said review copy, and you force consumers to go in blind. Indeed, worse than blind. You could argue the only footage they've seen is carefully crafted marketing material, ergo they're going in having been manipulated one way or the other. That is not an informed consumer. That is the opposite of an informed consumer. I don't like that. Do they have a point, however, when they say that the game should be experienced as a full package? Well, yes and no. Now, usually I would have a little bit more sympathy for a company that was making that argument. If there was a specific element that required the game to go live in order for it to work, then okay. I mean, you can't give a complete review until you've actually played that particular mode or experienced that particular functionality. That makes sense, right? That's what you might think initially. Well, yes, but as we've seen frequently in the past, it's entirely possible to run servers prior to launch. It's incredibly easy, in fact. That's why we have a lot of multiplayer betas, like, oh, I don't know, Doom's multiplayer beta. This is why I can't take this statement seriously. They claim that Doom is supposed to be experienced as a complete package, and yet they willingly released a incomplete package in the form of the multiplayer beta weeks before release. That indicates to me that they actually don't believe their own rhetoric, otherwise they would have never done something like that, and especially considering that doing so gave the game something of a negative impression. Doom sits on Steam right now with a significant number of negative reviews from the user, or at least it would have had they not got rid of that page. Yes, I am deadly serious. The page upon which these negative reviews were placed on Steam has been deleted completely. You can't find it anymore because Doom's beta product has been removed from the Steam store entirely. Now, half of me thinks, that's entirely reasonable. Ultimately, those reviews are probably not all that useful anymore because they only represent a portion of what the game is actually offering. It was in beta state, which it really wasn't, A couple of weeks before release is not beta state. The game's basically done by then. They're just putting the finishing touches to it. However, it's not the complete product, so while those reviews might hold some water, they probably shouldn't be on the main page for the product. But it is awfully convenient that Bethesda's second most hated game ever on Steam happened to vanish from the Steam store page. I do thoroughly expect some people to reinstate their review as soon as the game actually comes out, but unfortunately that would require them to actually buy the game, and at that point Bethesda doesn't actually care what you do. Anyway, back on topic. The excuse that multiplayer and Snap Map are not available until release is a fairly weak one, because there are plenty of examples of games that have had their multiplayer servers up prior to release. It's an especially egregious one when they have demonstrated several weeks ago that they already have matchmaking fully functional, because they had a multiplayer beta, for God's sake. Just being able to turn that back on, except with all the maps, seems like a perfect solution, and it's not uncommon for review copies to have multiplayer functionality. It can be difficult to find a game sometimes. That's why you actually see quite a few YouTubers, streamers, and even games journalists sort of getting together to form multiplayer games so they can actually experience it for themselves prior to release. This is especially true with a piece of functionality like Snap Map, for instance. You may not be aware, but Snap Map is the quick service within the game which allows you to create a bunch of maps, do custom triggers and things like that. I actually am quite excited about the functionality because I love the idea of designing maps, but I'm terrible at it. And it's almost like they've gone for a somewhat Mario Maker approach, a very easy, accessible level editor. But it only supports 4-player multiplayer. That said, that means that it's incredibly easy, I think, to get 3 other streamers, YouTubers, etc. together in order to test the Snap Map functionality prior to release. And yet Bethesda, in their infinite wisdom, decided that no, actually, we're not going to let you do that. We're going to make you wait until day one. Now, there are good reasons for outlets to hold their complete review until somewhat after release. They're not incentivized to do so, but it, weirdly enough, is pro-consumer to do it, simply because we've had way too many incidents like the Halo Master Chief Collection, where upon launch, the servers have just taken a giant nosedive into the ground, and as a result, the multiplayer experience has been poor to non-existent. It's very relevant information to the consumer, and of course, if you play the multiplayer purely in a controlled environment prior to release, then you don't know whether or not your experience is going to be truly representative of what the consumer can expect. And most of the time, let's be honest, it won't be. It may be pitch perfect for you because you had a team of server techs on hand to make sure that that actually happened, but as soon as it went into the wild and the servers were overloaded and fell flat on their face, well, suddenly your assessment of the multiplayer isn't so relevant anymore, is it? Because nobody can bloody play it. The counter-argument to that is that, generally speaking, those problems get fixed fairly quickly. The issues that we had with the opening night of The Division, for instance, well, they disappeared within that night. Same with Rainbow Six Siege and various other games. You know, the strain that was put upon the Hearthstone servers when they released their new expansion, that went away after about 4 or 5 hours. So you can say at that point, well, my experience was valid, just not in the first few hours, so my review is also valid. But then again, you also get situations like Master Chief Collection where things take months to properly fix, and in some cases never really get fixed at all. As a result of this changing climate, as a result of this particular trend in games lately, where a multiplayer mode will be released and then simply not work properly on launch, several outlets have got to the point where they've said, look, we're not going to give a final score to the game until we've been able to play the multiplayer in the live environment with other actual players, as opposed to a controlled environment. Now, I think that is valid, honestly. I think that's a good way to do a complete review, and I think it would have been a good way to do Dooms as well. I mean, it's not like they have a choice in the matter at this point, but here's the problem with asking outlets to do that. There's a fairly large crowd of what I would describe as sort of casual core gamers. I know that's a sort of weird way to look at it. I'm talking about people that play a lot of core games, but they're not necessarily involved in industry discussion, in consumer activism, in circles that have, say, heightened awareness, such as forums and subreddits and so on and so forth. People that are kind of aware of what's going on in the industry on a day-to-day basis, at least on a surface level, because they keep track of various news articles and all that sort of thing. This big group tends to be the one that pre-orders everything. This big group tends to be also the one that will go to whatever the first review is, regardless of the outlet. Whereas a more informed or more experienced gamer probably has their preferences, whether it be Twitch streamers, game reviewers, YouTube critics, or whatever. They have a list of people that they believe they can trust and where they get their information from, whereas these more casual core gamers, well, they just get whatever review comes out first. The problem with limiting these review copies until launch is that that also means there is no embargo whatsoever on the coverage. Now, I've talked about embargoes in the past and how they can be abused, but also why they are potentially used as an instrument of fairness and can actually protect the consumer in some scenarios, because they ensure that outlets do not rush out their coverage and in doing so make a bunch of mistakes and mislead the consumer. Problem with a no review copy situation is that you are incentivized to rush out coverage, because people reward you with that. The longer you wait, the less views you get, the less money you make. It also perhaps behooves you to be one of the first on Metacritic, because a lot of people visit that site to try and find reviews. If your review is the only one up there, then you are going to get a boost in traffic, and of course, the stock in your brand will rise, because it's your name out there, not somebody else's. Problem with that is, Metacritic only allows you to submit your first score. If you make a mistake, if you get a false impression of the game based on the fact that you rushed through it, or indeed you didn't finish it at all and then applied a score to it anyway, well, there's no way for you to change that, and as a result, that score's going to sit on that site pretty much for eternity, potentially misrepresenting the product to the consumer. That is not a good thing. Some outlets can be trusted to actually spend enough time to finish the game properly and apply a score to it. I've said time and again, I don't believe you should ever be scoring a game unless you've actually beaten it. There's a reason I don't do it. I don't believe scores are even a good thing and they should be abolished entirely, but I also don't do reviews. I do first impressions. They're incomplete and you go into them knowing that. And as a result, you shouldn't put as much credence and as much stock in what I have to say based on an incomplete impression versus someone that's actually beaten the game. That said, it's quite obvious, I think, that my format has an advantage. I don't have to beat the game. When Doom comes out, I will most likely stream it, get maybe halfway through the campaign, play some multiplayer and snap map, and then probably put together my first impressions on the basis of that. And that will be out quicker than whoever's doing a full review at IGN who has to beat the whole campaign, who maybe has to try it a second time in the different difficulty modes, and obviously the modifiers that can be done there as well. I mean, in a way, you can say that this whole idea of not giving out review copies is advantageous to anyone that's a streamer, because you can just go live as soon as the game does, and hopefully, assuming it doesn't break, start streaming it immediately, and people will come and consume your content instantly. And you might think as a result that I actually support the concept of not sending out review copies, but I don't, because that's nonsense. And not giving information to the consumer prior to release means that they're going into the release blind. That's a bad thing. It's never good to have an uninformed consumer. It's never good to put the risk in the hands of the consumer any more than they already have to. They're the guys that have to pay for the games. We're the guys that don't have to pay for them. We don't really accrue any risk. That risk goes on them. And that isn't fair. That's not how it should be. They should have access to that information before the game is launched. And really, saying that the servers are not going to be up prior to release, whose fault is that exactly? It's not as if it's impossible to set up servers and launch them prior to release. Games do it all the time. Games that are a lot smaller than this, games that don't have anywhere near as much budget or hype behind them. They manage it, why can't you? Well, that's a great question, and that gets us right back around to the very real possibility that this is less of a technical issue and more of an attempt to exercise full control over the information that gets out there prior to release. Once the game comes out, of course, they don't have any more control over it. But how many consumers are willing to actually wait for that? You know, a prime example of what I'm talking about is there's so little Doom single-player footage out there that a awful camera video taken from the NVIDIA event has almost 400,000 views. I mean, Jesus Christ, the game is being displayed on a projector screen and it's being filmed at a slant, and yet it has 400,000 views. The only stuff that is on YouTube right now is controlled, carefully controlled, drip-fed to content producers, or indeed just published by id and Bethesda themselves. Now, should we, as content creators, as critics, or even as gamers, be skeptical of any game that does not release review code? I think it's safe to be skeptical of anything, regardless of whether or not review code is actually released, but there's certainly a much better reason to be skeptical of something that does not release that information. I think skepticism should be the default position when it comes to video games, especially big budget ones. A lot of them are not awful by any means. You know, there are very few truly awful AAA games. As much as some people might like to say, well, gaming sucks now, everything's awful. It really isn't. You know, if you want to play awful games, the shovelware that comes on Steam on a daily basis, those are awful games. Old Atari 2600 stuff, those are awful video games. AAAs these days, they're never really truly awful outside of some of the most dire circumstances, but they can have a lot of problems. They don't have to necessarily be good either. I think there's a great reason, multiple great reasons, to be skeptical of such things. We've seen games launch in incredibly poor conditions that should know better, games that don't even work properly, games that aren't what they're promised, games that were thoroughly misrepresented, aliens, colonial marines. Skepticism is a natural state of being if you happen to be a core consumer in this industry at this point, unless you've not been paying attention. So, when a company takes a step like this, when a company says no review code and gives a fairly weak and frankly hypocritical, as I explained earlier, excuse for not giving out review code, you have the right, in fact, I would encourage you to be skeptical. Now, some might say this is simply me being vindictive. I'm saying, well, you didn't give me a review code, so I'm going to slam the game prior to launch. Well, no, because I have not played the campaign, so I can't give you an impression of it. I can only give you an impression of the multiplayer beta, which, as I said, was not a very positive experience. But the skepticism is simply encouraging you to be a little bit more careful with your money. We'll be giving the game a fair shake when it comes out. In fact, I'll be streaming it probably as soon as it's available, simply so that I can give as much information as quickly as possible to the consumer. Why would I not do that? It behooves me to serve them in that way. That is my job. There's no point in me skipping this title just because Bethesda and id made this particular decision. It doesn't help when I don't look at the game. That just means consumers have less information. But honestly, I think at that point, publishers and developers cease to have the right to complain if coverage is rushed, or if coverage is incomplete, or if coverage is based on the early segments of a game. Because they didn't give us the game ahead of time. They didn't give us the time to dedicate to that game. So of course we're going to rush, because ultimately we run a business and consumers reward early previews. And here's the thing, Developers and publishers like Bethesda and id have actively encouraged that culture. Any company that has hyped their game to the level, or even close to the level of Doom, is engaging in that kind of culture. You're saying to the consumer, be excited for this game you've never played yet. Be excited for something incomplete. Be excited for this little piece of edited footage that we just released, which may or may not be representative of the final product. But don't worry about that. Be excited. Get thrilled. Get hyped. Override your logic. Override your common sense. And for the love of God, please pre-order our video game. And you make those consumers hungry for that information. It doesn't matter how incomplete or misrepresentative the information is. They're going to consume it anyway. And you're the guys that encourage them to do it. When it comes to Doom, Bethesda and id are going to reap what they sow. People already believe that they lack confidence in their product because they will not give out review code. They're going to suffer rushed coverage. They're going to suffer a raft of first impressions as opposed to detailed reviews that were able to take the time prior to release to actually beat the campaign and thoroughly explore the functionality of the multiplayer and snap map. They have most likely done the numbers and said, you know what? It's maybe more beneficial to drive pre-orders off hype and day one copies before information gets out rather than actually give this access to people. That's assuming the game sucks. It may very well not. I'm not going into this hoping that it does. I want it to be good. I want the single-player campaign to be phenomenal. I certainly hope that it is. But I will say this. I think as a long-term strategy, it is doomed to fail. Har, har, har. An early boost of sales from uninformed consumers I don't think is going to make up for the diminished long tail of people that figure out that the game is actually terrible or whatever once information comes out. I'm not saying the game's terrible, because again, I haven't bloody played it outside of that multiplayer beta. But if it happens to be, then word is going to get around extremely quickly, and of course, people are going to point right back to the decision not to release review code as an indication that Bethesda and id knew their game wasn't up to snuff, and they deliberately went out of their way to mislead the consumer. That's not a reputation you want to get. It really isn't. So my advice to companies in future is this: don't pull this nonsense. Even if multiplayer is not available, there is nothing stopping you from issuing an embargo which says you can't put out a review, but you can put out a piece of footage or you can put out a critique of the single player, as long as you are clear that it is that. You know, outlets are not going to go out of their way to disobey an embargo. It's in their best interest to do it. And frankly, any outlet worth its salt doesn't go out of its way to be a pain in the arse when it comes to the publisher, developer, and content creator relationship. We're all sort of in it together in a way. And yes, we may be adversarial by necessity in order to ensure that we remain honest and are able to give a fair and just criticism of the product for you. But we still have to work together. So we're not going to deliberately screw each other over, right? Publishers? Yeah? You understand that? I certainly hope you do. The question is, I suppose, is this sort of thing even relevant anymore? This is going to be a boon to streamers, and a lot of people are now going to make the argument that, look, reviews are just rapidly becoming irrelevant. I can just watch someone play hours of uncut gameplay as soon as the game comes out on stream, and I can figure out whether or not I'm going to buy it. I mean, at that point, you could say that reviews are not necessarily irrelevant, but you have to rely on the consumer to be patient and not just want to play immediately. Look, if all consumers were patient and didn't buy on day one, then none of this would be a problem. It's weirdly enough completely in the hands of the consumer as to whether or not a publisher or developer has any of this power anymore. The power is given to them by those that pre-order. They can get away with this stuff because people willingly pre-order. And if Doom ends up sucking, well, I'd like to say that I have sympathy for those that pre-ordered the game and that I'd go to bat for them, and I would go to bat for them, but I'd still turn around and say, God damn it, guys, why did you do that? Now, how many times does this need to happen before you learn your lesson? Good question. There you go, folks. A few words on the subject of games that do not receive review copies prior to release, and a little bit of information as to how I personally am going to be covering Doom. So do expect a very early stream of the game, assuming the damn thing even works, on twitch.tv/TotalBiscuit, and then a first impressions edited down a little bit later. My name has been TotalBiscuit. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, by all means, do feel free to click the like button. If you did not, the dislike button is right over there, and I'll see you next time.